Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this program is World Watchers, and it's program number 703, June the 3rd, 1985. For the local listeners down the coast and up to the northern area, I just want to remind you once again, and I won't be putting it on every broadcast, starting Saturday night, June the 8th on KMFO. There'll be a talk show from 6 to 8:30. Later, it'll probably spring on into a 3-hour 7 to 10 on Saturday night, 7 to 9 or 7 to 10, with John Arlen. We'll co-host a talk show. People will be calling in, and this is your chance to talk back or ask questions or contribute to the World Watchers program that I hope you listen to every week. It's 1540 at the dial, at the top of the dial. It's a different format, the AM radio program. There's shorter answers. You have to take more questions per hour, that you know how fast they move along, but we'll be able to get a lot of information out and share things that you have on your mind. There's a new organization starting on the Monterey Peninsula in Carmel, and it's a national international organization called Bridges Worldwide, building people-to-people bridges. And the effort is to coexist, specifically with the Soviet Union, stop talking about nuclear war that ends life on planet, stop the arms race, and see if we can't have people exchanging visits, articles, lectures, travel, whatever, to find out what we have in common instead of keep underscoring the evil beast, the Antichrist, over in the Soviet Union. There are people working for peace, and I think you'll hear more about it. I think a very important part of this effort to get an alternate to war came with the pressure of Star Wars, and the Bitburg episode finalized a lot of ideas in people's minds that event is causing them to move in other directions. Leonard Bernstein is taking a group of musicians around the world, 18,000 miles, on a tour for world peace. He doesn't have the power and might or the budget of the Pentagon, but getting into the minds and hearts of the people is important, because it takes the people to conduct the war and pass the bills for the money, for the binary nerve gas, for the MX, for the Star Wars. The people pay, and they send people to Congress who have permitted this so far, and maybe there'll be some pressure on the elected representatives to hold back, and they seem to be pulling back somewhat at the present time. A woman whose father started the McDonald's hamburger chain, Mrs. Kroc, lives in San Diego, and last week she spent $200,000 for a newspaper ad about the military-industrial complex, and she referred to the speech of Eisenhower warning us about the complex, and that's very important. That complex that Eisenhower warned about us is in power now. I never quite understood the conflict between General Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur, and I've been detailing the historic differences between them and why the John Birch Society was always after General Eisenhower, or Otto Skorzeny was supposed to kill Eisenhower. And a lot of it has to do with the power of Douglas MacArthur and Charles Willoughby and the Southeast Asian, the fascists from Franco Spain, from Mussolini's Italy, from Nazi Germany, with Mr. Carl Wiedenbach, whose name became Charles Willoughby. I'll be doing more in the weeks or months to come on that issue. But when Eisenhower stepped down as President of the United States, he was afraid of this group, and that group is really in power today, and they hold the whole Southern Belt. Of course, he took Richard Nixon as vice president for 8 years, and Nixon's contacts with the munitions industry, the war-making machines, the Nazis, and the Southern Belt was a step towards Nixon's presidency, and what he was warning about, we got. But the point is that this woman is putting an ad in the paper, an expensive ad, and calling attention to these situations. And it's never too late, because they still are in the planning stage of Star Wars and haven't dropped the bomb. There are things happening, governments that are just on the brink of becoming fascist again. The world banks are trying to totter them, but they are holding on, and a lot of times people get depressed about the news, and I cite the change in Argentina, where the Nazi death squads are out, and there's a democracy there now. In Bolivia, where the angels of death, the fiancés of death, the KLAUS Barbie Nazi regime are out, and there is a hanging on in there, democracy in Bolivia. In Italy, Licio Gelli was forced to flee, and the plans of the Otto Skorzeny, Borghese clique were revealed in 1981, and Licio Gelli is still hiding. He's not in control as he would have liked to have been, say, starting in 1981-82 with the coup there, and he tried one in the 70s. Greece got rid of their Nazi dictatorship. They had election this week, and Andreas Papandreou, who once was in exile, was reelected by a large majority, and he was even making statements such as the Korean airline being a spy plane and purposely downed. Bringing out those facts and calling attention to these issues didn't hurt him at all in the election. Brazil had an election, and I'm going to do a lot more on that for the most part of this program. And after 21 years, the military dictatorship was out. Of course, the president-elect was killed, and the vice president had only been 1 year with that party. He'd been 20 years with the military dictatorship, so we'll see why he switched alliances and what he's going to do with that very dangerous situation that could go back to the dictatorship. And Uruguay has had elections and put in a democratic government. There's no more Dan Mitrione and the torture and the death squads there. So there are changes in the world. Iran got rid of the Shah with the Savak, and a lot of people may say it's Khomeini better. The fact is that the powerful Shah was out, and the Pahlavi family was always linked to the Nazis. So these are examples of democracies that have thrown out the Nazi regimes and the death squads, and one that's left to be overthrown is the United States. And of course, I believe in 1963 we had our coup, and that we have to push these people out of office for whatever reasons are the most expedient, but they have to be removed from office so this country can go back to being whatever it was before World War II, and supplying the death squads and the means and the technology to murder people all over the world. But there are changes coming up, and I think one reason organizations such as Bridges Worldwide is being formed, and I've been invited to the first steering committee meeting and meet the members and so forth, is that people are realizing that to just confront each other with the mutually assured destruction or to make more weapons and more weapons is ridiculous. And so finally, at a national and an international level, and I'll share some of the advisors with you and directors and officers soon, they're trying to find a better way, these people on the peninsula and around the country and also overseas, to meet, as I say, people from the Soviet Union, to make friends in other countries and to generate discussions of ways to communicate other than just bombing each other out. The news this week about Argentina, again, shows how fragile that democracy is. They just raided the home of the former security and intelligence agent who was planning a military coup again against Mr. Alfonsín, who's been president for 15 years. And they have caught these terrorists with their arms and electronic equipment and the cells that have been set up to overthrow that government. Eventually, besides going after a few black people who had a Brinks robbery in New York, that's the extent of our terrorism here, we'll have to go after the Aryan nations, the Brotherhood, and really break open those cells with the arms that are 10 times equal to what are being stored in Argentina now to overthrow that country. The Washington Post and LA Times had a story on Bolivia. Bolivia's steady slide, will it be contagious? And they're telling how hard it is to have democracy, and that it may, with all of its inflation, slide back into the dictatorship, the cocaine group that were there before, and it's very fragile. They call attention to that, and they compare it to the Brazilian government. Can they hang in there? All of these democracies that I've cited are sort of like those septuplets. They stay the same and losing out, and a couple have died. But maybe they can hold on. If the people have the will, maybe they can hold on. Some senators even came out this week and suggested that Caspar Weinberger should quit. He should have quit a long time ago for the policies he's had and for opening up, as Secretary of Defense, the attack against the Soviet Union, that they have to change their ways or they can't exist at all. That was practically the opening speech of Ronald Reagan when he became president. If they get mad about a $1,000 ashtray, that's okay. They maybe get mad for the wrong reasons, not for lives, but for money. But hiding $50 billion is a good reason, and that can continue the coup that we had in this country by buying up the news media, buying radio stations, TV, printed news, and supporting their own policies and supporting the funds of members of Congress running for Congress. There's no tab on this money, and if they can accumulate $50 billion hidden in their funds now and $50 billion next year, they can buy up everything in this country they need to wrap up the coup that took place in 1963. The Pentagon wants to duplicate its size. I suppose you read that. They want to spend $300 million to make a second Pentagon. They already have right now in Washington, D.C., 9.1 million square feet dedicated to making war. That's the Pentagon plus the offices that they rent out and in Washington, D.C. and in Maryland. So if we could only get 9.1 million square feet dedicated to people wanting peace, and with that amount of money, I'm sure we could have peace. I don't know how many of you saw the article of John DeLOREAN about DeLOREAN. It was on the wire services that he wants to start a new car company. It's interesting that his face is in the news. Several weeks ago, there was a full-page article about the hands that are protecting John DeLOREAN, and I'll go into that large article with you later, that he literally has this Teflon that bounces off. He's the luckiest man in the world. Well, now he wants to start up another DeLOREAN car company, a man named Marvin Katz, who's vice president of KPAC, K-A-P-A-C in Ohio, wants to help DeLOREAN start his motor company. And one of the people behind the DeLOREAN resurgence and to get money for his business is none other than Gordon Novell from New Orleans. Now, Gordon Novell worked for the British American Canadian Corporation for Permindex. He worked out of Miami with Double Check. He worked with the CIA. He was part of the people involved with Clay Shaw down in New Orleans. And Jim Garrison, the district attorney, wanted to prosecute Gordon Novell for his alleged role in the Kennedy assassination. He's named throughout the Torbett document of his role with the people that killed John Kennedy. He surfaced at the time of Watergate, of Charles Colson hiring him, wanting to hire him to erase all the tapes in the White House of Richard Nixon. Nixon would still be president. It's interesting that Novell comes into this picture right now with DeLOREAN. He brags about having helped DeLOREAN get off on the case, the cocaine case, which I have alleged is linked to Joseph Mengele and Klaus Barbie. And with my connections of the Nazis to John Kennedy assassination, it's very interesting how Gordon Novell is surfacing with John DeLOREAN. He also has been allegedly been charged with sending letters to the members of the jury at the trial of John DeLOREAN, and they never checked this out to see whether he did it or not, but his name surfaced many times, blowing the case and telling them, don't believe this case, the government entraps these people. And instead of calling a new trial or following, who sent the letters to the members of the jury had their home and address numbers, their names and addresses, personal mail, first-class mail. Instead of prosecuting or investigating that or starting over, the case was thrown out and DeLOREAN was home free. And at the time that I started writing for Larry Flynt and did only 2 articles, Gordon Novell moved into the home of Larry Flynt and moved into the Hustler offices when I was describing John Singlaub and the Los Angeles Police Department and the very people funding the Contras and our Central American policy right now, and also in my article on the Kennedy assassination, the links of the Nazis to the Kennedy assassination. So I have DeLOREAN with these allegations that he was linked to the Nazis in South America on the lam, and Klaus Barbie, who was arrested, and the money that he gave to Barbie that went into Mengele's account. So I think it's more than interesting that the person behind DeLOREAN Motors, the resurgence of the motors, is none other than the great Gordon Novell, who was never tried in New Orleans because the governor of Ohio, Mr. Rhodes, kept him in Ohio, and he never went to trial. Another interesting web that I'll detail much further in the next few weeks has to do with the story of Louis Farrakhan, who came home from Libya with $5 million in, quote, loan. He doesn't have to pay any interest on it. At $5 million to Mr. Farrakhan, who said that the Jewish religion was something to the effect of bastard religion, and I don't have the direct quotes in front of me. Now, Louis Farrakhan helped break up Jesse Jackson and the elections in 1984 that assured the presidency of Ronald Reagan. The blacks and the Democratic Party were far from each other, and this was a main issue until they could take the Geraldine Ferrara mafia funds and the illegal money that her husband had, entangled with the Democrats at both ends. Now, Gaddafi recently signed a contract and a mutual agreement on coexistence with the King of Morocco. The public relations man registered as a lobbyist for the King of Morocco until he became the appointed head of our United Nations, Vernon Walters, what represented Morocco for all these years, for the past 4 or 5 years, while he was our roving ambassador for Central and South America, a Knight of Malta, of course. And now Robert Keith Gray is a public relations firm that represents the King of Morocco and set up headquarters there for their annual party, and I do want to update that story. Gray represents the CIA. I've said that was the takeover of the Mullen office after Watergate. He was the escort of Rosemary Wood during the period when the tapes were to be erased, and 18 minutes were erased, and Gordon Novell was part of that whole operation around these people. Gray and Walters are close to Morocco, and with their agreement with Gaddafi, he then siphons money over to Farrakhan. So literally, the GOP again has the means and technology to just throw in all these bucks into Illinois to Farrakhan and split the Democratic Party, assuring the presidency of George Bush in 1988, heading Task Force 157 with Henry Kissinger and Robert Keith Gray, and breaking up that dumb Democratic Party who can't tangle any of these issues. And Farrakhan again will surface, believe me, is a registered Democrat, and Jackson and siphon and splits the party, and you don't have to worry about who's going to be elected president. With this kind of money and these connections that have affected all the other coups around the world in every major country, and now the bucks are going right into the hands of Farrakhan from Gaddafi, who also worked with Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple of Task Force 157. I didn't, getting on to another subject, 2 names that show up all the time. William Clark, former National Security Advisor and Interior Secretary, and Jeane Kirkpatrick have been named on a panel by Ronald Reagan in charge of what to do with the American nuclear arsenal. Do you feel safer at night with Jeane Kirkpatrick and Mr. Clark? William Clark, Army Intelligence, brought Helene von Dahm over here from Germany and Vienna, and set her path to the Reagan administration in California, and then as the Secretary of Appointments, the head of appointments in the White House for 5 years, and then as our ambassador to Vienna. Now, Clark is going to sit with former Defense Secretary and CIA Director James Schlesinger, a retired General Frederick Crogsen, Kroesen. I want to spell that right. Frederick, Frederick, Crogsen, and scientists Harold Agnew and William Perry. So Ronald Reagan has made one of his wonderful appointments, William Clark and Jeane Kirkpatrick, deciding what to do with the nuclear arsenal. I talked about the controversial appointment of public broadcasting a while back. I didn't have time to update some of Reagan's appointments, but Mrs. Percy was kicked out. She was too liberal, and he put in a new head of public broadcasting that would see that it went political in the terms of moral majority and the Heritage Foundation and the way that the right wing that put Ronald Reagan in wants it to go. Edward J. Pfister, Pfister, just resigned as head of the president of the Corporation of Public Broadcasting. He sent in a letter and wanted to leave December 31st. They said, you can leave by June the 15th of, that's next week of this year. He wanted to do programs, trading shows and working with the Soviet Union and selling broadcasting, and so they kicked him right out, and he said there is definite political interference in public broadcasting. And it's a strange thing, but Ted Turner of CNN picked up the ball that public broadcasting couldn't do, even though you're supposed to pay money to help them, and a lot of the funds come from the public, and the control is done in Washington. Ted Turner opened up a contract with the Soviet Union, and he's going to have reporters and shows and interviews and a constant discussion between the United States and CNN, which is a far cry from Jesse Helms and D'Aubusson and the people that were behind him in trying to buy up a CBS. So it'll be interesting to watch what comes over Turner's broadcasting, the CNN, and I watch it more all the time, the news. I just can't stand the other broadcasting except for 60 Minutes. But now he's going to do what public broadcasting wouldn't allow. I also just want to update one item, May 27th, the Jack Anderson story about the agent. The title is Agent Told Drop It. I have never had a chance to continue the evidence of Raymond Donovan and all the information I'd like to share. We did a few broadcasts on Raymond Donovan, but just this past week, an FBI agent testified that when he came across allegations that Labor Secretary-designate Raymond Donovan had close ties to the underworld, he was told by the FBI to forget it, don't pursue it, leave the matter. The investigation he was talking about was the one I had on the air. They gave it a title, TUMCON, capital TUMCON, and it was Surveillance of Mobsters in 1979. And I talked about those 892 tapes that referred to Mr. Maselli talking with Raymond Donovan on them and discussing the murder of Mr. Frascone, among other things. There was a murder discussion in there. And Jack Anderson refers to the close links of Maselli to the Genovese family. And my allegations 2 years ago, almost 3 years now, is that Raymond Donovan got the appointment of Secretary of Labor because he had hired the person who was responsible for killing Jimmy Hoffa, and by getting rid of Hoffa, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan had all the Teamster votes. The GOP got the Teamster votes, and that the construction company was a very complicated construction company that involved the mafia and murders and murdering of witnesses. And the important thing about this article, just updating it, was that this agent, Special Agent Lawrence T. Sweeney, SWEENEY, of the FBI New York office, was told that by the informant that the Schiavone Construction Company was tied to the mafia, and that Donovan, who was then serving as vice president, had particularly close ties to both the Genovese family and La Cosa Nostra. Of course, it's the Genovese and Vito Genovese that I'm interested in because of their work with Jack Ruby and Dallas, Texas, and with Army generals and so forth. Now, I'm not going to do too much on the trial in Rome for several reasons. It's taking place now, and I think you've seen some of the articles that came out. The very first day, Mr. AGCA, MEHMET, MEHMET, Ali, ALI, AGCA, AGCA, got on the stand and shouted, I am Jesus Christ, I am omnipotent, I announce the end of the world will be destroyed. And he threatened the judge. The judge told him to stop some of these things, and he came in and he said, Your Honor, I'll get you later. That was the first day, and then he went on later to talk about his communication with God. He said, I communicate a message from eternal God. Today I will expect a reply from the Vatican. If the Holy See remains silent, I will continue to collaborate with the court. If it denies what I have said, I can no longer speak. So what he is saying is, I'm collaborating with the court. He was originally given a life sentence, and he made the remark in court that I'm perfectly sane, I'm a rational man, I'm rather intelligent. And he said from his cage that people may think that he's crazy, but he's not. And he said there's no place in this trial for such definitions as whether he's crazy or not. Well, the place in the trial is for the question of leniency. He was, as I say, given a life sentence for 1 year, and then he changed his story, and if they could find a KGB Bulgarian plot, even going to the very highest in the Soviet Union, he would be out in 10 years. Well, he's been in for 4 years, so he'd be out in 6 more years. So he can change his story, and he says that he'll continue with the court if the Vatican comes to see him, a representative of the Vatican, the Holy See. He'll continue to collaborate, work with the court, and manipulate these stories. That's how I translate it. But if they deny seeing them, he won't speak. And if he doesn't speak, he's the primary witness. And, of course, he links this alleged plot to the secret of the Madonna of Fatima. And this was a paper locked up by Pope John the 23rd, a prediction in 1960 on literally World War II, the destruction of humanity in the second half of the century. And I'm sure that AGCA wasn't skilled in all the Catholic stories about Fatima and so forth when he shot the Pope. Now, when he was in Turkey, he was making statements about shooting the Pope. The fellow who gave him the weapon from the Grey Wolves said he didn't know what he was using it for. AGCA was always a political animal, more political, in some ways overtly political than Lee Harvey Oswald was ever political. and he never was to the side of the left or the communists, and he killed in Turkey a publisher who was a leftist publisher and wanted to kill the Pope. Well, to create the links to the KGB and to Bulgaria is exactly what the Nazis perfected with the Reichstag fire and Stefano della Calle and the various counteractions, the bombings and the traces, the Red Brigades, the killing of Aldo to make it all look like leftist events. The skill of these people is to leave the traces that the left did it, and all the time they're working with the right-wing fascists. One very clever thing that came in the news was William Safire's article, and there's many to this effect. This came out last week, titled "Turning the Spotlight on Cardinals and Conspiracies," and he's talking about the possibility that the plot will go up to the KGB, and that the CIA pulled back and had such discretion that they wouldn't disturb anything because they let it evolve into its own natural self, and that the CIA in Rome just were ridiculed because they wouldn't touch this story. And our CIA director at home, William Casey says, wisely shut up and left it to AGCA. Well, that isn't true. We had CIA people with AGCA. We had them in the jail. We had them coaching him. And the whole point is that by Safire writing this, he puts the smear and the innuendo that the United States had the good taste of staying out, and now the Italian courts can work this plot out. Now, if AGCA goes crazy, he's a primary witness, or blows the case, then the argument for the United States government for their propaganda against the Soviet Union would be the smears like, we would have gone to trial, but AGCA went crazy. But the innuendos and the smears are there, just like after the investigation of the Warren Commission assassination, looking into the Kennedy plot. They didn't find any evidence at all that Oswald worked with the right wing, or they didn't look for that, just like AGCA here. They looked for the left, for Castro, and always the suggestion of the Russian wife, the handbills in front of the World Trade Center in New Orleans, and making a record, I'm a Marxist with a man for military intelligence. The innuendo always was, and printed in the pages, like the Bulgarian connections, was the communists killed the president. Now, I can't believe that the court in Rome is going to come up with anything but a manipulative conclusion. Either the case will be thrown out because AGCA will go crazy, or they'll continue along these lines. Remember the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978-79 in the United States spent $6 million to investigate the murder of John Kennedy again and Reverend Martin Luther King. It wouldn't touch any of the connections to the Nazis, to the YF, to Robert Morris, to Argentina, the things I wrote about in Rebel magazine. They put $16 million and wouldn't allow any input from Mae Brussell, wouldn't accept the Torbett document. So we have mastered the way to have massive investigations and still come up with nothing. And being as the CIA is literally running Italy and has for so many years, ever since World War II and even before, with the links to the Vatican and the intelligence of British intelligence, but particularly after World War II, they can manipulate anything they want. The evidence doesn't have to be important. The witnesses can be totally crazy. They can be fascists and say, well, we didn't know why he was going to use the gun, but we gave it to him a few days before. This is reliving a deja vu of what the Warren Commission was doing, and I think for a whole new generation studying history, it's worth looking at that trial carefully and seeing how, in the course of the events since 1981, how they take a story and weave it and print it and reprint it and reissue the same lies over and over again, and then come up with a cockamamia trial that is so ridiculous and weave a fabric of a conspiracy here that makes you think that the Soviet Union and Bulgaria go out and shoot the Pope because of his involvement with Solidarity, and how the Polish Pope is nudging the Polish people to rise up against the Soviet Union and affect their policies. Now, if the Soviet Union wanted to kill the Pope, as explained many times, they wouldn't hire a man who walks into the area where the Pope's going to be and ask where St. Peter's is. They would have a man there and a backup, and if they wanted him, the Pope would be dead. You don't take a guy like this who's worked with fascist organizations, drug dealing, narcotic, just put him in that area, hand him a gun, and expect that that is the way the Soviet Union would want to kill the Pope if they wanted to kill the Pope. He's the most visible Pope in the world, and he didn't have the Pope mobile at the time, and was traveling all over the world and wanted to be seen and wanted to mingle with people. So it wasn't that hard. But this way, by keeping this alleged assassin alive, they can manipulate his mind and change the stories and create a story out of a non-story that they have worked for a long time, but the evidence may not have to fit it at all. And this trial will be going on for a long, long time, probably for a year, but I won't be updating it except occasionally because I've said pretty much about it in the past, so the individual names and the circumstances aren't that interesting. We'll take a 1-minute break now, and then we'll come back, and I want to talk about the country of Brazil and what is going on there at the present time. This is Mae Brussell. This is the second half of World Watchers, in case you just picked it up in the middle and didn't get the first half hour. It's a 1-hour broadcast titled World Watchers. It's broadcast number 703, June the 3rd, 1985. There are two very important and large countries that had the murders of the heads of state this year. They're important strategically and also for what was happening politically with these countries. One was India, that huge land mass, oceans on both sides, largest non-aligned country in the world, of the largest of the non-aligned countries, a democracy, a country that represented opinions from both countries, that dealt with the Soviet Union. I call them, there's two countries that exist, the Soviet Union and the United States. The confrontational policies for all purposes involve these two major conflicts, and these non-aligned countries have to choose sides, which is awfully hard when the bully next door is clobbering you on the head. This country, the democracy of India, represented by Mrs. Gandhi, she referred to the United States shortly before her murder as being a country that only puts in military dictatorships. She was horrified when Maurice Bishop was killed, and she has noted the other events that we've done in many of the countries around the world, particularly when Mr. Bhutto was killed in Pakistan and Zia put in by Henry Kissinger and the CIA and the Defense Department, and she was vocal about this, calling attention to that fact. The other large land mass, the huge mass, if you study the globe, and most of us don't study it often enough, just look at the size of Brazil and their borders, and they manufacture the most weapons in South America. They probably have the most Nazis in South America. It was a large place for harboring Nazis before, during, and after the war. There's a concentration of them in Chile and in Argentina and Paraguay, but Brazil was notorious for these connections. They had elections for the first time in 21 years. They overthrew the military dictatorship that the United States government and the Knights of Malta, specifically Vernon Walters, were very instrumental in putting into effect. And on the eve of the inauguration of the president-elect, he went into the hospital, he got sick, and he was there for 7 surgeries and died. April 22nd, 1985, this past April, broadcast number 698, I pointed out 9 different things that I thought were important regarding Brazil and the conflicts there. I won't repeat them, but if you haven't heard part 1 of Brazil, I suggest you get that tape and listen to it, because Brazil is a very important country. I ran out of time with the article from the Washington Post on Mario Bernardo Garnero, and I will continue with that. I hope I have time this evening, on the Brazilian bank regime that collapsed. Again, linked to William Simon, the Knight of Malta, to George Shultz, to Henry Kissinger, and to the people in this country that very effectively can get rid of head of states to continue specific policies they want. And one of them, of course, is bringing in narcotics traffic, such as escalating it in Southeast Asia and in Pakistan and South America with KLAUS BARBIE and Bolivia. And now Brazil was becoming a cocaine dealer and distributor and a grower just at the time of the elections when the governments changed hands. Now, just to update some of the stories on Brazil, the San Jose Mercury had a story April 23rd, a quotation from a woman. Shirley Williams. She was formerly a member of the Parliament in London, and she said that she received a letter from a friend who's well connected in diplomatic circles in Brazil, saying it was believed that Neves, that's Neves, was murdered. We're talking about the president-elect. I'll spell it for you because I'm not sure that, the pronunciation is right. Tancredo, Tancredo Neves, Neves. The S is silent. She received word that they believed down there in the diplomatic circles that he was murdered. The San Francisco Chronicle had a story April 23rd, again repeating her statement about the fact that they thought he was murdered and that the Brazilians expressed doubts about this and that they wanted a full inquiry. And the British Broadcasting Corporation was saying that there was widespread belief in Brazil that Tancredo Neves had not died of natural causes. A lot of this was covered up by all of the news media with the Bitburg matter with the president going to the graves of the Waffen SS, but this was a wire service story, and it was out here in the San Francisco Chronicle. I mentioned last week how the Catholic friar Leonardo Boff was silenced, and I located the article from the San Francisco Chronicle and put into its chronological order. This is a very liberal member of the Catholic Church who was sent to Italy and reprimanded by the Pope. As I say, his active Knights of Malta have been instigating the collapse of banks and financial involvement down in Brazil. But the election, after it was over, the inauguration was supposed to be in March the 15th. And right after the death of the president, just a few days later, this 16 days after the president-elect died, the big black letter of the headlines in San Francisco Chronicle, May 9th, said, Brazilian friar ordered by Vatican to shut up. That 16 days after the president-elect was murdered, this very radical spokesman against fascism was told to shut up. Now, I reproduced a speech that he gave that somebody had sent to me with the tape last week, and he mentioned Ronald Reagan and Augusto Pinochet, the head of Chile, as being a source of a lot of problems. Now, Ronald Reagan is close to all the enclave of the people, all of his political life, who effected the first coup in 1964, and he worked with the Rockefeller Commission in covering up the second investigation of political assassinations of the CIA, and Henry Kissinger, part of these operations always, was the one who worked with Richard Nixon and ITT and John McCone, a Knight of Malta, and the CIA in having Salvador Allende murdered. So that when you talk about Pinochet and you talk about Reagan as being the source of the problems, you're talking about assassinations and murders in order to keep these people in power, working with Nazi death squads, but right out of our government in Washington, D.C., and working with George Bush and as director of the CIA as part of these operations. So I'm sure that Mr. Boff might have spoken up. It was only 16 days after the death of the president-elect when he was told by Pope John Paul II, don't open your mouth for 1 year. And I was just shocked that the term just shut up. That's quite clear in the newspaper in case you wonder what it means. The interviews with various doctors down in Brazil and São Paulo, Brazil, were interesting. There was one reprinted in the San Francisco Examiner. They were asked why the U.S. specialist didn't come in earlier when the president-elect was sick because he had some stomach trouble. At first it was appendicitis. Then it was just massive infections from the surgery, evidently in his stomach, that caused 7 operations. And they were very painful operations. I mentioned that once they opened him up towards the 5th or 6th and just laid a sheet of plastic over him and didn't even close the wounds. I mean, he was just left to die. They couldn't close the wounds, and they kept using the same area to cut him open. Incidentally, the San Francisco article has a quotation of the president-elect. Just the last thing he said before he died, he was with his favorite grandson, and the quotation was, I did not deserve this. Those were said to have been the last words of 75-year-old Neves before he lapsed into a final coma last week. I didn't deserve this. I don't say he deserved the pain and it was literal torture, but I ask the question again, could he become the president-elect of Brazil if he had ever questioned the murder of John Kennedy, The coup that happened here in 1963 was followed a few months later, around February of 84, in Brazil, or Jim Jones living in his hometown in Belo Horizonte and the CIA when Jonestown broke and the borders of Guyana touch along that northern border of Brazil that's now being used for narcotics traffic. Where are these people? Can they be elected, or should they even be elected? Once they get in, they're killed anyway, such as John Kennedy or the candidate for 1968, Robert Kennedy. Even if you don't work your way to the top, is it better to speak up along the way or say, when I'm president, I'll do this, and then you never become president? Do you deserve that if you keep silent all those years? I kind of take a hard line. Yes, you do. I rather have a lot of people speaking up and fewer people running for office and having an alignment with connections that require them to be silent about things they know. Getting back to this medical report, they asked why the United States specialists weren't called in, and the answer was, that's an interesting question. They wouldn't elaborate, but they didn't continue giving him the best medical care from the moment he got the stomach infection after dinner with the Archbishop in Belo Horizonte. Now, a lot of you don't like Lyndon LaRouche's politics. I don't. You don't like the things that he says. They're very confusing. But he has one thing going for him, which I absolutely appreciate, maybe for different reasons than he does it, but it's called the Kissinger Watch, and in Executive Intelligence Review, the subscription was given to me by a friend who, this was a very nice gift, and I want to say thank you many times when I read it, because I don't know if he wants me to mention his name on the air. Well, I can. It's Charles Spears in Texas, who sends out so many letters and political bombs of his own that I could put this on. He gave me a 2-year subscription to Executive Intelligence Review put out by Lyndon LaRouche, and every week they have a page called Kissinger Watch, and this is the story that he had about Henry Kissinger just at the time that the president-elect was dying in Brazil. On Monday morning, April the 15th, callers from different parts of the world were trying to reach Henry Kissinger on business. It was impossible to reach him. Dr. Kissinger himself was on business at the White House. At 10 a.m., he showed up at the President Reagan's office in the company of former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now, Brzezinski was behind of covering up, if not long planned before they were in power, but covering up and working with the Jonestown operation. And also with him was former U.S. Defense Secretary James Schlesinger and former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Jeane Kirkpatrick. Those are the two appointed to decide about our nuclear arsenal that I just cited before, Schlesinger and Kirkpatrick, with Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, April the 15th. That is at the exact time when Mr. Neves was clinically diagnosed as never going to survive, and all of these people have worked in Central and South America. And I cited earlier in March the luncheon that Henry Kissinger was having in the White House with the president, and the suspicions of their role in Brazil, because Brazil is very important to the world banks and to the narcotics traffic and the particular pressures that are in South America now that Bolivia has changed hands, and also the pressure in Paraguay to get Joseph Mengele and democracy in Uruguay. They were developing, these people, the narcotics traffic in Brazil. And when the president-elect was dying, the new vice president was a man who was 20 years with the military dictatorship and switched the last year to become vice president under a man who's going to be offed just at the time that he's to be sworn in. It reminds me of LBJ, who didn't want to be vice president and reluctant, and they coaxed him to it. And, of course, the rest is history, because the arrangements had been made already to get rid of John Kennedy, so he got the presidency by coming in the back door. London Times, April 21st, this is 1 week after the luncheon in the White House, had a story titled "Democracy in Question as Neves Fades." He's ready to go, and the story says Brazil is preparing itself for the worst this weekend as the president-elect Tancredo Neves is kept alive by a battery of machines after 7 operations. The man who would succeed him would be Jose Sarney, S-A-R-N-E-Y, the vice president, but he was thrown into Neves' government as a makeshift at the insistence of those who, like himself, had left the pro-military government party, the PDS, to join the opposition and he was chosen by NEVES to be the architect of Brazil's transition from military to civilian. If NEVES dies, the London Times says he will try to keep this coalition together. Now, the problem he faces, this is on the front page of the Sunday London Times, April 21st, 230% inflation they were left with, and a $100 billion foreign debt. You know, you watch where the money goes, and you know exactly what's going to happen. A $100 billion debt and a surgery on your stomach 7 times, and you're through. And so they're going to expect a man who switched to that party just a few months before, which is interesting, and was sworn in as president to be able to handle his military friends and keep this country together. The United States and the Knights of Malta from the Vatican, the intelligence community, have a system, a formula, a recipe to put in over and over again the same techniques, the same people, to affect what they want, to get what they want. And some of these countries, such as I cite Argentina with the trials there, have tried now to change all of this. And this is what we have to think about doing, because the cooks in the kitchen are in Washington, in the Pentagon, and instead of closing some of the offices off, they want to duplicate and recreate themselves a second time and have a second Pentagon, because they say they don't have enough space. Now, one of the Kissinger Watch articles that I particularly like from the Executive Intelligence Review was April 23rd, 1985, and the title is Simon, that's William Simon, the Knight of Malta, Board of Helionetics, with Edward Teller, Star Wars. You know the connections. I mention Simon almost every week. He's working with the Contras, with Heine Adderholt, with John Singlo. This story is called Simon, Safra, and Drugs. And it goes on to say that there is a financial relationship, an international relationship in drug traffic that has increased in magnitude in Brazil in the last couple of years. And this was cited by a man in Italy who was on trial. I'll quote his article in a few moments from the Washington Post. It goes, among the most influential banking figures on the Brazilian scene are all the good friends of Dr. Henry Kissinger. For example, there's William Simon, former Secretary of the Treasury, multi-millionaire director of the Kissinger Associates. Henry Simon is on the board of Kissinger Associates, the roving hit squad that Congressman Gonzalez referred to as the hired gun that the State Department has rented to them. William Simon funding, as I say, the Contras, making the policies with J. Peter Grace and Claire Luce and Alexander Haig, all Vatican envoy to keep the Contras going and to get rid of the Sandinistas. He's on the board of directors of Kissinger Associates. The article says Simon is a fanatical advocate of free trade policy such as the British East India Company had, if you know what they're referring to there, and the British control of the Southeast Asian area. While they're still controlling it in a way, affecting and being a part of the murder of Mrs. Gandhi, to keep the confrontations of divide and conquer and try to get her to India, her son, to the western side. It goes on, Mr. Kissinger's name has surfaced again as a close buddy of Brazil's Garnero. That's the fellow that was under investigation and who was about to be arrested when the president-elect went into the hospital. He's the director of the dope-linked Brazil Invest, BRASIL INVEST, that I mentioned just briefly in April, this corporation that is under investigation in Brazil. There is another man, Edmund Safra, and this is a new name I haven't had on the programs, SAFRA, Edmund Safra, who is head of the Safra Bank in Brazil. It's one of the top 10 banks in the country of Brazil. Safra is the international director of American Express. Henry Kissinger is on the board of American Express. Gerald Ford is on the board, among other people. He's also the international director of the Republic National Bank and of Geneva's Trade Development Bank, all which are interlaced with big international narcotics interests. Several of Safra's banking mergers, for example, have been arranged by Kenneth Bialkin, B-I-A-L-K-I-N. Now, Bialkin is the Jewish representative, the only Jew to be represented in the White House for Ronald Reagan. He went to Israel conveniently when Reagan made the decision to go to Pittsburgh But Bialkin was the man who said it's okay to go to Bitburg. The Jews will forget. It's fine. You can visit the Waffen-SS. You can invite the Waffen-SS to the ceremony, which he did. Bialkin is the senior partner of the law firm of Wilkie, Farr, and Gallagher, and he's the lawyer for Robert Vesco. Now, Robert Vesco put the money into the runway at Grenada. The excuse to invade the island was that Maurice Bishop was going to let these huge Russian transport planes land there to take over the whole Caribbean and the United States eventually. And it turned out that the excuse was created by Robert Vesco, and Frank Turple was at Grenada shortly before the coup there when Maurice Bishop was murdered. And, of course, Alexander Haig and Mr. Califano and the same people working with Brzezinski at the time of Jonestown were involved with the takeover of Grenada. And Robert Vesco I don't believe he's out of the service. I think they have him roving around the Caribbean for these particular things, just like they have Frank Turple roving around for these coups and effecting these coups. Now, Mr. Bialkin not only makes the mergers for Mr. Safra, but he is head of B'nai B'rith, the Anti-Defamation League. He is the head. And remember and keep in mind, I mentioned that he put Mr. Kissinger on the board of Amex. Now, several weeks ago, I said that when Fritz Kramer, Kissinger's mentor, I believe it's that one, we don't have proof yet except the age, the looks, and the position, went to Zurich with a check. He was accompanied by a man from the Anti-Defamation League, and I'll do more about that man again in the next few weeks. I have some interesting articles, that somebody from the Anti-Defamation League went with Fritz Kramer, and they were taking checks from Willie Carto, an organizer of Nazism in America, Canada, and overseas, and head of Liberty Lobby, and went with the courier over to the account of Joseph Mengele. So that Henry Kissinger is close to the head of the B'nai B'rith, and so was that his mentor, who was accompanying Mr. Buell, the man from Associated Press, to take money to Europe. So Mr. Safra has one of the largest banks, 10th largest bank in Brazil, and works closely with Henry Kissinger and with Mr. Garnero, and the money situation where Brazil is not only under tremendous debts, but the banks have been collapsing, and a lot of money was put into Garnero's account to help bail him out. A very important man was arrested just last year. His name is Tommaso Buscetti. I have mentioned him before, but haven't done enough about him. He was and is a mafia boss who, in return for his giving information about drug traffic around the world, is getting some kind of leniency. And in a story in the Washington Post, this was just November 22nd, anniversary of Kennedy's death, 1984, Mr. Buscetti, Tommaso Buscetti, was revealing the drug connections that he has, the worldwide drug connections that come out of Sao Paulo, Brazil. And he's telling about the Amazon jungles, and he lived in Brazil. Buscetti was extradited from Brazil. That's where he lived in July. Now, I don't know what date the elections were when Mr. Neves was elected for president, but in July, Buscetti was taken from Brazil. He was heavy into heroin traffic in Italy. He's facing indictments in New York, but in Brazil, October 83, he talked clearly about the shift to the cocaine trade. See, in 1983, KLAUS BARBIE was arrested and was in France, and the cocaine traffic was shifting from Bolivia and Paraguay, where Mengele is, to Brazil. So in October 83, when he was arrested, Brazil, he said, was heavy into the cocaine traffic. He lived in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He broke parole in Italy in 1980. He had been arrested. He returned to Brazil. He built a network in Brazil based at this name is ITATIAIA, Itatia. We'll just spell it for you, and you've got it. And he brought cocaine base into Brazil from Peru. Now, Stefano Della Calle fled to Peru when KLAUS BARBIE was arrested. He's in Peru, and the cocaine base was going and is going with the affected coup. It probably is continuing into Brazil from Peru and Bolivia with a fleet of light planes. So they transferred the operation from a lot of it from Bolivia and Peru into Brazil starting in 1982, 1983. This Buscetti was arrested laundering drug money, and he was found with having a company making sports shirts, and it actually was for cocaine. In the last 2 years, according to the Washington Post, Brazil has been acquiring importance as a corridor from the Andean producing countries, as political disturbances in Central America were heating up and a crackdown against the traffickers in Colombia was going on. They escalated into Brazil. Now, whenever you hear drug traffic articles, most of them in the United States, it's the Colombia sending it to Fidel Castro. But you don't hear how they're tying up the Colombia cocaine so that Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Brazil can develop into the largest cocaine dealers and send it out from there to the United States and into Central America and over to Europe. The Washington Post says, in geographical terms, Brazil is right between the producer and the consumer. They have 10,000 miles of frontiers. And again, the Guyana borders on one of those frontiers. Brazil is joining the ranks of cocaine producers. And they recently found 10 million plants showing the intent of them to become big producers. In the operation, police found signs that Peru's guerrillas were using Brazil for refuge. According to Pavoa, Peru's foreign minister, Mr. Roca, claimed that the Sendero links with traffickers during various debates on the drug problems came up at the Organization of American States, and they said the network of clandestine airstrips in the vast area is unpoliced in the Amazon, and the drug is carried by mules. Mules are women who are forced to carry this through the corridors of the Amazon, where it ends up in Europe, where they're hard-pressed because the Colombian producers are being stopped from growing and distributing. So that Brazil, at the time of the elections, and with wiping out the president-elect, was becoming a major drug country, which is very important also because of the banking problems and the links of these people, the Nazis and the United States intelligence, to the drug traffic. Now, as typical of the United States, this article from the Washington Post says the Drug Enforcement Agency has been very lenient. They don't think it's important, these methods of traffic. And just about 2 months ago, it came out that the Drug Enforcement Agency knew that Joseph Mengele was in drug traffic with KLAUS BARBIE and that he was drug dealing down there, and they didn't think that was important. So the DEA had a budget last year of $250,000 to follow the drug traffic in Brazil. Imagine after Mengele and Barbie, Mengele's on the run and Barbie's locked up, and all this is going on in Brazil, the DEA looks the other way. Well, they look the other way all of the times with KLAUS BARBIE and Joseph Mengele, and it is the drug traffic that allows the agencies and individuals to have the money to buy weapons to effect coups and military dictatorships in the future and to stockpile the weapons for when they want them. The Washington Post said that there's a treaty between Brazil that gives Paraguay duty-free access to Santos. The officials found chemicals of European origin are shipped to non-existent firms in Paraguay, that's Mr. Mengele's home base, and from there to Bolivia. Now you can see why Mr. Stroessner, the president of Paraguay, is flying up to Germany. A lot of the chemicals, this article says, come from Germany. He's flying up there to have a little discussion now. And this is a huge amount of money people are dependent upon, and I wouldn't be surprised that the drug traffic and the banking ties that are being put together are closing in on these people, and they have to have alternate strategies or else their particular governments collapse. The Washington Post says that, as I say, it went to Paraguay and from there to Bolivia. Since 1981, Brazil has controlled the production and the sale of ether and acetone, and the police have detailed maps showing the supply routes of the chemicals from Canada and West Germany through to the Andean nations. So not only does the Executive Intelligence Review often reveal the dope traffic and the banks, and they seem to be very accurate on that. They are really against the drug traffic to a large extent, not defending them on many things, but I have to give credit for the attention of the banks and Henry Kissinger, and then this ties into connections that are important in overthrowing countries, because drugs and Nazis and dictatorships go hand in hand. I did refer several weeks ago to the article, again, in Executive Intelligence Review. Brazil asked Uruguay about dirty practices. This was as soon as the elections took place, and the vice president, of course, then became the president. But Mr. Neves was still in the hospital under his 4th or 5th surgery when about ready to die. Actually, when this article came out, the Brazilian government has asked their neighboring Uruguay to answer questions about its role in the asset stripping of the major Brazilian bank, Banco Sul Brazil, it's Sul, S-U-L, Brazil, B-R-A-S-I-L-E-I-R-O, Banco Sul Brasileiro. It was put into receivership by the government in January of 1985. It has gone bankrupt. It left $300 million hole in Brazil. Brazil's acting president, Jose Sarney, seems to have made a deal with the Congress that the government would make one more expensive bailout of this particular bank, and the directors were jailed and tried on criminal charges. If he's cut a deal to only go into one bank, then the country's in trouble. They suggest that some kind of a deal was made, and I haven't read a thing about Mr. Garnero and his company since Nev passed away, and I want to do a lot more on that next week. I don't want to lose that up. This article said the trail leads to Uruguay, that $300 million, where they recently placed many loans to fraudulent shells. Uruguay has become known as the Switzerland of South America, not just because of the stability of the social democratic system. During World War II, titled families among Hitler's supporters in Central and South America chose Uruguay to safekeep their gold hoards, and it is apparent that the Nazis would lose the war and they wanted the money in Uruguay. After the war, the flow from Eastern Europe increased, and Licio Gelli, the Grand Master of the illegal Freemasonic propaganda Lodge, carried the fortunes of Italian fascists to Uruguay. In 1982, Gelli was found to have filled an entire Montevideo building with his offices, and of course Reverend Moon practically controls the banking of Uruguay. I have to leave off there now. I want to do more on Brazil next week and update a lot of other articles, but the time is out. This is the end of this hour. It's Mae Brussell from Pacific Grove, California, and I'll be back with you next week.